At some point in life, a strange realization appears. From the outside, everything seems fine. You've built something. You've moved forward. You've survived. You've adapted. But inside, there's a quiet disappointment you rarely say out loud. This isn't the life you wished for because somewhere along the way, your life became smaller than your potential. You replay moments from the past, decisions you made too early, things you accepted too quickly, paths you didn't take because they felt unrealistic at the time. And even though those moments are long gone, they still shape how you think, what you expect, and what feels possible now. Especially after midlife. This book is not about regret. And it's not about fixing the past. It's about understanding how your past quietly became a filter, a lens that keeps blocking the future you're still capable of. Because until you see how that happens, you'll keep living inside limits you no longer need. To understand why your life feels narrower than it should, we need to start with a difficult truth. Your past doesn't block you because of what happened. It blocks you because of the conclusions you drew. Conclusions about who you are, what works for you, what is realistic now, and what you should no longer expect from life. Over time, those conclusions stop feeling like thoughts. They feel like facts. That's the midlife trap. Not being held back by circumstances, but by outdated interpretations of yourself. In the first chapter, we're going to uncover how your past quietly became a mental framework, why your brain keeps protecting old stories instead of new possibilities, and why real change never starts with motivation, but with seeing what's been running in the background. Chapter 1. See the Shadow. How your past quietly built your prison. James opened a box in his garage on Sunday evening and found himself crying for the first time in 23 years. From the outside, everything in his life looked carefully constructed and successful. The executive title, the stable salary, the house that appeared impressive in photographs. But inside that box was a letter he'd written to himself at 25. And the moment he read those words, something fundamental shifted. The letter was simple and almost childlike in its certainty. Never risk what you've built. Never let people down. Stay in control. That's how you survive. What struck him wasn't that he'd written these words, but that he'd completely forgotten writing them. His conscious mind had no memory of making this promise to himself. Yet his entire life had been filtered through exactly these instructions for the past 2 decades. Every significant choice he'd made, every opportunity he'd declined, every relationship he'd kept at arm's length, all of it had moved through these words, like water through a sieve, letting only certain possibilities through while systematically blocking out everything else. The past doesn't block your life because of what actually happened to you. It blocks you because of the conclusions you drew from what happened. And those conclusions your brain has been defending as absolute truth ever since. Most people assume the thing holding them back is rooted in specific events. A parent who was emotionally distant, a failure that stung, a moment when you took a risk and it didn't produce the outcome you wanted. But events themselves are completely neutral until your mind decides what they mean and what they say about you. Your past only gains real power when you've unconsciously agreed that the interpretation you created from it is permanent and unchangeable, and somehow more real than any new possibility could ever become. The actual prison isn't the past itself. The prison is the story you've been living inside, about what the past means, about who you are, and what's allowed for you now. When James was 25, he experienced a failure at something that genuinely mattered to him. The specific details matter less than what happened inside his mind immediately afterward. He decided, without even knowing he was deciding. That failure meant he was no longer permitted to take risks. Not consciously, not with those exact words. But his nervous system absorbed this lesson completely and permanently. Every neuron associated with risk-taking got tagged as potentially dangerous. Every impulse to do something unconventional got intercepted before it reached his conscious awareness. By the time he turned 30, his brain had built such an effective filter that he genuinely believed he was naturally cautious, naturally responsible, naturally the kind of person who didn't dream in bold terms. He had no awareness that he was actually protecting an old fear and dressing it up as a personality trait. This is exactly how the shadow mechanism works. It never announces itself as a limitation or a constraint. Instead, it presents itself as fundamental truth about who you are. You don't think to yourself, "I'm living small because I'm unconsciously protecting myself from a conclusion I made decades ago." You think instead, "This is simply who I am. I'm not a risk taker by nature. I'm not especially creative. I'm not the kind of person who changes direction in midlife. I'm not that kind of person." And because you've believed this narrative for so long, because it's been reinforced by thousands of small decisions and thousands of opportunities you didn't pursue, it stops feeling like a belief and starts feeling like an unchangeable fact about reality itself. Your brain is extraordinarily efficient at protecting you from old pain. And more significantly, especially efficient at protecting you from pain you don't consciously remember experiencing. When something hurts us when we're young enough and deep enough, we don't always store it as a clear memory. Instead, we store it as a pattern in the nervous system. A reflex. A filter that determines what feels safe and what feels dangerous. At 25, James's brain learned that being vulnerable, trying something without guaranteed outcomes, doing something that might make him appear foolish to others, that particular kind of exposure was dangerous. So his nervous system created what you might call a bodyguard, an internal filter that whispered to him every single time he considered taking a risk. This situation is not safe. You need to stay where you are. You need to stay where you're in control. The voice was so constant and so woven into his inner landscape that he never questioned whether it was actually protecting him or whether it was actually imprisoning him. The mechanism operating here is actually quite elegant from a neuroscience perspective. Your amygdala, the specific part of your brain responsible for detecting threat, operates faster than your conscious mind by roughly 12 milliseconds. This doesn't sound significant until you understand that those 12 milliseconds represent the difference between a thoughtful, reasoned decision and a pure impulse. They represent the gap between reaching out to connect with someone and instinctively pulling away. Your amygdala learned patterns from your past, and now it automatically filters every new situation through those patterns before your conscious mind has even a chance to evaluate whether the pattern is still relevant to your current life. Something in the moment reminds your nervous system of danger from long ago, and it closes doors before you're even aware that a door was open. But this is the crucial thing to understand. That mechanism isn't broken or defective. Your brain isn't malfunctioning. It's doing precisely what it was designed to do across human evolution. The problem isn't with the amygdala itself. The actual problem is that your amygdala is operating from information that is now dramatically outdated. It learned its job when you were younger, more vulnerable, living in a completely different context with completely different constraints. Back then, the conclusions you drew might have been adaptive. They might have helped you survive what you were surviving through then. They might have helped you adopt a role that kept you safe. But now, those same conclusions are running your life without your conscious permission. And they're operating as security guards who still believe there's a threat that actually stopped existing 20 years ago. James didn't fully understand the extent of his filter until that moment in the garage. He'd spent so much of his life trying to prove his competence and worthiness and control that he'd never stopped to ask whether that relentless striving was actually getting him somewhere he genuinely wanted to go. He had achieved everything he thought he wanted to achieve. And it turned out that what he'd wanted and what he actually needed were two completely different things. The achievements had come at the cost of spontaneity and genuine connection. The control he'd built had made his life progressively smaller. The safety he'd constructed had paradoxically trapped him until the only thing that could crack the prison open was this moment in the garage holding a letter from his younger self. So when you look at your own life right now, at the areas that feel constrained or smaller than you know they could be, I want you to notice something important. The constraint probably isn't coming from actual external circumstances or limitations. You have more choices available to you than you think you do. You have far more freedom than you've actually been using. The prison you're living in is constructed entirely from conclusions. The walls are made of stories you've been telling yourself, and the guard standing at the gate is your own nervous system, doing what it thinks is its actual job, protecting you from a danger that might not even exist anymore in your present life. Here's what I want you to do right now. Not eventually, but actually right now in this moment while you're listening or reading. Take 15 minutes and think carefully about an area of your life where you feel trapped or constrained or smaller than you want to be. Maybe it's your career and you feel locked into a job that genuinely drains you. Maybe it's your relationships and you feel unable to show up as your authentic self. Maybe it's your sense of what's possible, and you can't shake the feeling that major changes happen to other people, but not to people like you. Now ask yourself this question. Is this constraint coming from an actual external limitation? Or is it coming from a conclusion I made about myself a long time ago? If you can identify it, write down that conclusion. What did you decide about yourself based on what happened? What rule did you create in order to stay safe? What kind of person did you decide you were not allowed to be? The reason this matters is that you cannot change a prison you don't see as a prison. As long as you believe those walls are simply the natural and inevitable shape of your life, as long as you think your limitations are inherent rather than constructed, they'll continue holding you in place. But the moment you see the shadow for what it actually is, a learned pattern, a nervous system response, a story your brain has been running on repeat. The moment you see it as something constructed rather than as a permanent fact, something genuine shifts. You begin to understand that what was built can be rebuilt. What was concluded can be reconsidered. What was a survival mechanism can become something you consciously choose, instead of an invisible force running your life from the background. Chapter 2. Harvest the pain. Why your suffering is your secret fuel. Before we go deeper into your transformation, I want to introduce you to a framework that's going to guide you through the rest of this audiobook. It's called Shadow, and it's a 6-step system for liberating yourself from the patterns that have been running your life without your conscious permission. Each letter represents a different stage of this journey, and we're going to move through them together over the coming chapters. The first letter is S. See the shadow. That's what we explored in the last chapter. You learned how your past doesn't block you because of what happened, but because of the conclusions you drew from what happened. You learned how your brain builds these invisible filters and then defends them as absolute truth. You saw how James discovered the letter he'd written at 25 and realized that those words had been silently controlling every major decision of his life for the past 2 decades. Seeing the shadow means recognizing the pattern. It means understanding that what feels like who you are might actually be a protective mechanism that was created a long time ago. Now we're moving to the second letter, H, which stands for harvest the pain. And this is where things get real. Because seeing the shadow is one thing, but actually transforming it requires you to do something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You have to look at the pain that created the shadow in the first place. You have to feel it. You have to harvest it, which means gathering up all the energy you've been using to protect yourself from that pain. And instead of letting it stay buried, you redirect it into fuel for your actual life. This sounds simple on the surface, and it sounds terrifying in practice. Most of us have spent decades running from pain. We've built elaborate systems to avoid it. Through work, through relationships, through staying busy, through staying numb. Pain, from the nervous system's perspective, signals danger. And your nervous system's job is to keep you away from danger. So when you experience something that hurt deeply enough, your system learned to protect you by creating a filter that prevented you from ever getting close to that kind of pain again. The problem is that the same protective mechanism that keeps you away from pain also keeps you away from aliveness. James spent 23 years protecting himself from the pain of that failure when he was 25. He built a life where nothing hurt because he never risked anything real. His marriage was stable but distant. His career was successful but hollow. His relationships were predictable but not deeply connected. He'd achieved the safety he was protecting for, but the cost was that he'd also achieved numbness. He moved through life like someone watching it through glass, present but not participating, successful but not fulfilled, safe but not alive. The moment he sat in that garage holding the letter from his younger self, something broke open. And what came out wasn't just sadness about the failure from 23 years ago. What came out was rage at himself for spending 2 decades playing it safe. What came out was grief for all the relationships he could have had, but didn't because he was too afraid to be vulnerable. What came out was a kind of desperation, a recognition that if he didn't change this pattern now, he would die having never actually lived. This is what harvesting pain means. It means allowing yourself to feel, fully and completely, what you've been spending so much energy avoiding. It means letting the dam break. And here's the thing that nobody tells you about pain when you finally allow it. It doesn't actually destroy you. What destroys you is the energy it takes to keep running from it. What destroys you is the life you don't live because you're too busy protecting yourself from old hurt. What destroys you is the numbness that comes from spending decades in self-protection mode. When you finally allow yourself to feel the pain you've been avoiding, something extraordinary happens. The energy that was tied up in protection gets released. The nervous system that was locked in fight or flight mode starts to settle. You begin to have access to parts of yourself that were unavailable while you were defending. You regain access to your creativity, your spontaneity, your capacity to connect with others, your sense of humor, your sense of possibility. The pain doesn't go away, but it stops being the thing that's running your life, and it becomes instead information that you can actually use. Sarah, a 46-year-old professional, came to understand this in a way that changed everything about how she moved through the world. She had built her entire adult life around the idea that she needed to be strong for everyone around her. Her parents had been volatile when she was young, and she'd learned early that if she could just stay calm, stay controlled, stay the stable one, then maybe she could keep the family from falling apart. By the time she was 46, she was a therapist helping other people process their emotions while she herself had never cried in front of another human being in her adult life. She could articulate everyone else's pain beautifully. But her own pain was locked away so completely that she sometimes wasn't even sure it existed. One day in her own therapy, her therapist asked her a simple question. What would happen if you let yourself be the one who needs something? And something inside her cracked. She began to cry, and once she started, she couldn't stop. For 2 hours, she sat in that office and let out 26 years of grief. Grief for her childhood. Grief for the relationships she'd kept at a distance because she couldn't let anyone see her as vulnerable. Grief for the aliveness she'd sacrificed in order to stay strong. She cried for all the times she'd said, "I'm fine," when she wasn't fine. She cried for all the moments she could have connected with someone but didn't because she was afraid of being seen as weak. And then something shifted. After those 2 hours, after she had finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the pain she'd been carrying, she felt lighter than she had in decades. Not because the pain disappeared, but because she'd stopped using so much of her energy to keep it hidden. The energy that had been devoted to protection was now available for living. She went back to her job as a therapist, but something was different. She could be present with her client's pain without it triggering her own protective mechanisms. She could show up in her relationships with more authenticity. She could even laugh, genuinely laugh, in a way she hadn't been able to do since childhood. This is what harvesting the pain actually produces. Not the elimination of the pain, but the liberation of the energy that was being used to avoid it. And that liberated energy is fuel. It's the fuel that allows you to make different choices. It's the fuel that allows you to take risks. It's the fuel that allows you to be vulnerable, which is the only real foundation for genuine connection. It's the fuel that allows you to create. Because creation always requires vulnerability and risk. It's the fuel for your actual life. The life you're capable of living instead of the smaller life you've been protecting for. James didn't go to therapy immediately after that moment in the garage. What he did was sit with the pain. He let himself remember what it felt like to fail at something he cared about. He let himself feel the humiliation of it, the disappointment of it, the way it had shaken his sense of who he was. And as he sat with these feelings, instead of running from them, something happened. The feelings didn't destroy him. They moved through him. And on the other side of feeling them completely, he had access to something he hadn't had in a very long time. He had access to his own resilience. He understood, in a way that was deeper than intellectual understanding, that he'd survived that failure. He'd built a life afterward. He'd become competent and accomplished. He was still here, still intact, still able to function. The failure hadn't broken him. The 23 years of protecting himself from the failure, that was what had broken something in him. The mechanism here is actually quite elegant from a neurobiological perspective. When you suppress emotion, when you push it down and refuse to feel it, that emotion doesn't disappear. It gets stored in your nervous system, in your muscles, in your tissues, in the very way your body holds itself in space. The psychotherapist Wilhelm Reich called this character armor, the way the body literally armors itself against feeling. You've probably experienced this yourself. Someone who's been protecting from grief often stands with their chest collapsed. Someone protecting from anger often has tension in their jaw. Someone protecting from shame often curves inward. This character armor isn't a metaphor. It's a literal physical reality. Your body is spending energy holding itself in a protective posture, and that energy could be used for almost anything else. When you harvest the pain, when you allow yourself to feel it and let it move through your body, that character armor can finally release. Your nervous system gets the signal that the danger has passed. that it's safe to come out of protection mode. Your muscles can relax. Your breathing can deepen. Your sense of possibility can expand. The energy that was being used to stay armored becomes available for living. Here's what I want you to do right now, and I want you to take this seriously because this is where the actual transformation begins. Find a quiet space where you can be alone for at least 30 minutes. Bring a notebook or have your phone or computer ready. Think about a moment of pain in your past that you know you've been protecting yourself from. Not the biggest trauma. We're not asking you to go nuclear here. Pick something real, something that hurt, something you've probably avoided thinking about directly for a while. Maybe it's a rejection. Maybe it's a failure. Maybe it's a way someone hurt you that you never fully processed. Maybe it's a loss you grieved partially, but never completely. Now write about that moment, not the facts of it, but what you felt. Write the feelings you had at the time and haven't fully accessed since. Write the things you wanted to say, but didn't. Write the ways it changed what you believed about yourself. Don't censor yourself. Don't make it palatable or pretty. Just let it come out on the page. And if tears come while you're writing, let them come. That's not weakness. That's the armor beginning to crack. That's the energy beginning to be released. That's the first step of harvesting the pain that's been running your life. After you write, sit with what you've written for a few minutes. Don't analyze it. Don't judge it. Just acknowledge it. Maybe say something to yourself like, "This is what I've been protecting. This is what I've been carrying. And it's been real, and it's been heavy. And I'm finally allowing myself to actually feel it." You don't need to do anything with this pain once you've felt it. You don't need to fix it or resolve it or make it mean something different. You just need to acknowledge that it exists and that you've been using enormous amounts of energy to avoid it. That acknowledgement itself is the beginning of liberation. The next step, which we'll explore more deeply in the coming chapters, is understanding what this pain created. It created conclusions. It created vows. It created the filters and the armor that have been protecting you. But those protections, while they made sense at the time, are now outdated. They're now what's actually holding you back from the life you're capable of living. And once you've harvested the pain, once you've acknowledged what you've been protecting from, you're ready to look at what that protection created. You're ready to audit the vows. Chapter 3. Audit Old Vows. The secret promises that run your life. After James spent 3 hours writing about the failure from his 20s, after he'd let himself feel the full weight of grief and rage and desperation that came with finally acknowledging what he'd been protecting from, he put the notebook down and sat in silence in his garage. The door was closed. No one was watching. And for the first time in a very long time, he allowed himself to simply sit with what was true. The pain was real. It had shaped him. And more importantly, it had created something. A set of invisible rules, a collection of promises he'd made to himself about who he needed to be and what he was no longer allowed to do. This is what we're going to explore in this chapter. Those vows. Those secret promises you made to yourself, often without even realizing you were making them. They emerged from pain, from difficulty, from moments when your nervous system learned what kept you safe and what put you in danger. And they've been running your life ever since, often completely outside your conscious awareness. The strange thing about vows is that they feel like wisdom. They feel like protection. They feel like truth. But they're actually conclusions, interpretations that your younger self made about what it meant to survive what you survived. As James sat in that garage with the letter he'd written at 25 in his hands, he began to notice something. The words in that letter weren't the only promises he'd made to himself. That letter was just the most explicit version of a whole network of vows that had shaped every decision of his adult life. And as he traced back through those vows, he began to hear something else, a voice that wasn't quite his own. It was his father's voice. His father had been a good man in many ways. He'd been reliable and responsible, and he'd never missed a day of work in his entire life. But he was also a man who'd been taught that emotions were weakness, that vulnerability was dangerous, that the only way to survive in this world was to stay in control and never let anyone see that you were struggling. James remembered being about 8 years old and coming home from school in tears because another child had mocked him publicly. His father had looked at him with something that wasn't quite disgust, but wasn't quite sympathy either. And he'd said simply, "Men don't cry. That's not who we are. Crying won't change anything. It will only make you weaker in the eyes of other people. So you need to learn to handle this on your own without letting it show." That moment became a vow. Not consciously, not with those exact words. But at a cellular level, James's nervous system absorbed the message. Being seen in pain equals weakness equals danger. And from that moment forward, every time James felt the impulse to cry, to reach out for help, to show vulnerability in any form, that 8-year-old understanding activated. He learned to swallow his tears. He learned to solve his problems alone. He learned that needing anyone was a failure. He learned that the only acceptable version of himself was the version that was strong, in control, and completely self-sufficient. The vow he'd made in his father's living room that day, "I will never be the kind of man who cries, who breaks down, who needs help," became the foundation for almost every other vow that followed. When he failed at that business venture at 25, the pain of that failure triggered this deeper vow, and the conclusion he made was inevitable. Failure must mean I wasn't in control. Failure must mean I didn't plan carefully enough. So the new vow became, "I will never risk anything that might result in this kind of failure again. I will never put myself in a position where I'm not completely in control of the outcome." By his 30s, he'd created another vow. "I must never disappoint the people who depend on me." This one came partly from his father's model of reliability, but it also came from his mother's anxiety. She had been fearful and overwhelmed by life, and young James had learned that his job was to be the calm presence that kept her from falling apart. So he made a vow to himself that he would be the person who never caused additional problems, who always showed up, who always did what he said he would do, who never burdened anyone else with his own needs. By his 40s, these vows had calcified into what felt like his fundamental personality. He wasn't someone who had made these vows. He was someone who couldn't be vulnerable because that's just who he was. He was someone who couldn't afford to fail because that's not the kind of person he was. He was someone who couldn't ask for help because that's how he'd been built. The vows had become so much a part of his identity that distinguishing between what was genuinely him and what was a protective mechanism that no longer served him felt almost impossible. As he sat in the garage with this awareness, James began to ask himself some questions. These are the same questions I want you to ask yourself about your own vows. What promises have you made to yourself? Maybe explicitly. Maybe just through the way you've structured your life. What did you decide you would never be? What did you decide you had to always be? What conclusions did you make about how to survive, how to be safe, how to be acceptable? For James, the first vow that emerged clearly was, "I must always be in control." He could trace this one directly. It came from watching his parents lose control of their emotions, their circumstances, their lives, and deciding that he would never be like that. Control meant safety. Control meant you couldn't be hurt. Control meant you could manage outcomes. And for 47 years, he had organized his entire life around maintaining control. His weight, his schedule, his emotions, his relationships. Everything had to be predictable and managed. And the cost of all that control was that nothing in his life felt alive. The second vow emerged more slowly. I must never be a burden. This one was insidious because it disguised itself as selflessness. It made him seem noble, someone who never asked for anything, who always put others first, who was easy to be around because he never needed anything from anyone. But the truth underneath was darker. It meant he couldn't be vulnerable. It meant he couldn't ask for help when he needed it. It meant his relationships were fundamentally unequal because he never let anyone take care of him. It meant he was isolated, even in the midst of people who loved him, because they never knew the real him, only the version that needed nothing. The third vow was perhaps the most limiting. I'm not the kind of person who changes course mid-life. This vow had multiple origins. It came partly from his father's model. You chose a path and you stayed on it no matter what. It came partly from cultural messaging about what mature adults do. It came partly from the failure at 25, which had made him decide that the safer choice was always to stay where you were, where you knew the rules, where you'd already proven yourself. This vow meant that even though his career had become hollow, even though his marriage had become distant, even though his sense of purpose had withered, he couldn't change any of it, because changing would be admitting that his whole adult life had been built on the wrong foundation. Now here's the crucial question. And I want you to sit with this, even if it's uncomfortable. Are these vows still serving you? Are they still keeping you safe? Or are they now what's keeping you imprisoned? For James, the answer became clear in that moment in the garage. The vow to maintain control had kept him from ever being truly surprised, truly delighted, truly alive. The vow to never be a burden had kept him from genuine intimacy and connection. The vow to never change course mid-life had kept him trapped in a path that no longer fit who he actually was. The vows that had once protected him had become walls. The protections had become prisons. And here's what happens when you finally see this clearly. There's a kind of grief that comes with it. Because part of you doesn't want to let these vows go. These vows have been your identity. These vows have kept you safe. These vows have been your understanding of what makes you a good person, a worthy person, a person who deserves to exist in the world. Letting them go feels like you're letting go of yourself. But what you're actually letting go of is not yourself. It's the smaller version of yourself that you created as a response to old pain. James sat in his garage and he grieved. He grieved the identity he'd built. He grieved the life he'd constructed based on these vows. He grieved the relationships he couldn't have because he couldn't be vulnerable. He grieved the work he couldn't do because he couldn't risk failure. He grieved the version of himself he'd cut off in service of staying safe. And in that grief, something shifted. The vows no longer felt like wisdom. They felt like chains. But here's the thing about old vows. They don't just disappear because you've become aware of them. Your nervous system doesn't immediately believe that it's safe to let them go. These vows are encoded in your body, in your reflexes, in the automatic responses you have when you feel threatened. The work of actually dissolving them, of teaching your nervous system that you can survive without them, that's what comes next. That's where we move from audit, understanding what the vows are, to dissolve, actually releasing them. But before you can dissolve something, you have to name it clearly. So here's what I want you to do right now. Take your notebook again, and this time write 3 vows. Not in a questioning way, but in a clear statement. I must always be, or I can never be, or I must never. Write the vows that you've discovered running your life. Don't overthink this. Your body knows what these vows are. They've been operating you for years. Just let them come out onto the page. For each vow, ask yourself these questions. Who taught me this vow? Not necessarily deliberately. Maybe it was just modeled for me. When did I first make this promise? What was I protecting myself from? What would happen if I stopped living by this vow? Not logically. What does your nervous system say would happen? What has this vow cost me? Not just in obvious ways, but in the smaller ways. The conversations you didn't have, the risks you didn't take, the versions of yourself you didn't explore. And then ask the most important question. Is this vow still protecting me? Or is it now what's holding me back from the life I'm capable of living? James's answer to that last question was clear. These vows are no longer protecting you. They're now what's preventing you from being alive. And in that recognition, something becomes possible. The vows no longer have the weight of absolute truth. They become something you can examine, something you can question, something you can ultimately choose to release. They become not your identity, but choices you're making. And if they're choices you're making, then they can be choices you remake. Chapter 4. Dissolve the grip. How to release. What's holding you? James sat with his 3 vows for 2 days. He'd written them clearly in his notebook. I must always be in control. I must never be a burden. I'm not the kind of person who changes course midlife. And every time he read them, he felt something tighten in his chest. The vows were still there, still pulling at him, still shaping his automatic responses to the world. Understanding that they were vows, understanding where they came from, understanding that they were no longer serving him. All of that was crucial. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. His nervous system still believed these vows were keeping him alive. His body still held them as truth. And that's where most people get stuck. They understand intellectually that their patterns are outdated, but their nervous system is still locked in protection mode, still convinced that letting go of the vow means danger. This is where we move into the 4th step of Shadow the D, which stands for dissolve the grip. And I want to be very clear about what this means and what it doesn't mean. Dissolving the grip doesn't mean thinking differently. It doesn't mean affirmations or positive self-talk or trying to convince yourself that you're different than you've been. Those approaches work with the conscious mind, and your nervous system operates mostly below consciousness. Dissolving the grip means teaching your nervous system through direct experience that it's safe to let go. It means moving from understanding at the level of intellect to understanding at the level of the body. There are 3 levels to this process, and James discovered them almost accidentally. The first level is what I call notice, and this is where you learn to actually catch the vow activating. Before you can dissolve something, you have to see it in real time. Most of us live our entire lives with these vows running in the background, completely invisible to our conscious awareness. We just act on them automatically. We just live according to them without questioning. The first breakthrough comes when you're able to notice that a vow is being activated right in the moment, before your automatic behavior kicks in. It happened to James on a Tuesday morning, about a week after he'd written his vows. He was sitting in a meeting with his executive team, and one of the younger members of the team, someone talented but still learning, had suggested an approach to a problem that James immediately recognized wouldn't work. In the old days, James would have shut it down quickly and efficiently, would have made it clear through his tone and demeanor that the idea wasn't viable, and the team would have moved on. But in that moment, he noticed something different. He noticed that his body was tightening. He noticed that his jaw was clenching. He noticed that his breathing had become shallow. And underneath those physical sensations, he noticed something else. He noticed the activation of the vow, "I must always be in control." He saw it happening in real time. The young man made a suggestion. Something in James's nervous system registered this as a threat to his image as the leader, a threat to the control he'd maintained for decades, a threat to the reputation he'd built for always being right. And before his conscious mind had even fully processed what the young man had said, James's body was already preparing to shut it down, to demonstrate superiority, to reassert control. But because he was in the process of auditing his vows, because he was paying attention in a different way, he noticed the grip activating. He felt the constriction in his chest. He registered the narrowing of his perception that happens when the nervous system goes into protection mode. And in that moment of noticing, something shifted. He didn't immediately change his response. He just noticed. He created what you might call a micro-pause between the activation of the vow and his automatic behavior. And in that pause, he had a choice. This is the first level. Notice. And it's more powerful than it sounds. Most of your life is lived in this reactive space where an activation happens and you automatically respond, all completely below your conscious awareness. The vow activates, the body tightens, the behavior follows. Rinse and repeat 1,000 times. But when you can notice that activation happening, you create possibility. You create the space for a different response. You don't have to change anything yet. You just have to see it. The second level is what I call name. And this is where you actually get specific about what's happening. Because the activation isn't abstract. It's not just, "I'm nervous." It's something very particular. It's a specific threat from your past being activated by something in the present. And the magic happens when you can connect those two things. When you can say to yourself, "This is the fear from the meeting at 25 when I failed in front of my team. That's the fear that's activated right now in this moment. That's not actual danger. That's old danger. That's a threat from the past." After James noticed the grip activating in the meeting, after he created that micro-pause, something very interesting happened. Instead of shutting down the young man's idea, he paused and asked himself, "What is actually happening right now?" And then he did something he almost never did. He said to the young team member, "I noticed I was about to dismiss your idea automatically. Let me actually listen to it." And in saying that, in naming what was happening, something shifted. The young man expanded on his idea. The team engaged with it more thoughtfully, and while it ultimately turned out that the approach still wouldn't work, the way the conversation happened was completely different. It was collaborative instead of hierarchical. It was exploratory instead of defensive. But more importantly, something happened inside James. By naming the vow that had activated, "I must always be in control," which means I can't ever admit uncertainty or the possibility that I might be wrong. By naming it specifically, his nervous system got information that it desperately needed. It got information that demonstrating control didn't actually require shutting people down. It got information that he could maintain his sense of competence, even while admitting that he didn't have all the answers. It got information that he could survive not being the expert in the room. This is the work of the second level. Name. You don't just notice that something is happening. You get specific. You say to yourself, "This is the fear that I made a vow to protect myself from. This is the specific old threat that got activated. This is why my body is responding this way right now." And in naming it specifically, you're communicating to your nervous system, "We understand what you're protecting from. You don't have to protect in the same way anymore. We're safe enough to try something different." The third level is what I call release. And this is where you teach your nervous system through direct physical experience that it's safe to let go of the grip. The first two levels, notice and name, are mostly cognitive. You're observing and you're articulating. But the nervous system doesn't primarily learn through words. It learns through sensation and movement and breath. So the release has to happen in the body. There are several ways to do this, and different approaches work for different people. Some people find release through shaking or movement, literally activating the nervous system in a controlled way and then letting it reset. Some people find it through sound, allowing themselves to make noise, to vocalize what they're feeling, which interrupts the pattern of constriction and silence. Some people find it through breath, using specific breathing patterns to signal to the nervous system that it's safe to come out of protection mode. What they all have in common is that they engage the body directly rather than trying to think your way out of the vow. James discovered his particular version of release about 2 weeks after that meeting. He was alone in his house, his wife and kids were out, and he was thinking about the vow, "I must never be a burden." He was thinking about all the times he'd kept silent when he actually needed something. All the times he'd handled it alone when he could have asked for help. All the times he'd smiled and said, "I'm fine," when he was actually struggling. And as he was sitting with this vow, something in him just broke. He went to his bedroom, he closed the door, and he let himself cry. Not the polite tears he'd managed a few times before. Real tears, deep sobs that came from somewhere inside him that he'd kept locked away since childhood. And as he was crying, something shifted. The constriction in his chest that he'd been carrying for 47 years began to loosen. His breathing deepened. His body began to shake a little as it released decades of suppressed emotion. He wasn't trying to fix anything or reach any particular insight. He was just allowing his body to do what it needed to do. And in that allowing, the grip began to dissolve. Not completely. The vow didn't disappear, but it loosened its hold. His nervous system got the information it needed. You can feel your pain, and you will survive it. You can cry, and you won't fall apart. You can be vulnerable, and the world won't end. This is the third level. Release. It's not about willpower. It's not about convincing yourself to be different. It's about creating a safe container and then allowing your body to discharge the protective energy that it's been holding for so long. It's about moving from armored to open, from defended to available. And it happens primarily through somatic experience, through the sensations in your body, through movement, through breath, through sound. Here's the truth that nobody wants to hear. You cannot think your way out of a nervous system response. You can understand your patterns intellectually. You can have tremendous insights about where they came from. And you can still find yourself acting out the same vows because your body hasn't received new information. The nervous system needs lived experience. It needs to feel safe in situations where it previously felt threatened. It needs to discover through direct experience that you can survive without the protective vow. And that discovery happens primarily in the body, not in the mind. This is why the 3 levels matter. Notice helps you become conscious of what you've been unconscious of. Name helps you understand the specific threat that's being activated. Release helps your nervous system discover through direct experience that it's safe to let go. They work together. You notice the grip activating. You name the specific old threat. And then you create the conditions for your nervous system to release its protective hold. Here's what I want you to do right now. Think about one of the 3 vows you identified earlier. Pick the one that feels most activated for you currently. The one that's showing up in your life right now in ways that feel limiting. Notice where you feel that vow in your body. If the vow is, I must always be in control, you might notice a tightness in your chest or your jaw or your shoulders. If the vow is, I must never be a burden, you might notice a collapsing inward, a way of making yourself smaller. Whatever the vow, your body knows where it lives. Now do this. Bring to mind a recent situation where that vow activated. A time when you felt the grip tightening, when your automatic responses kicked in, when the vow was running you. Don't just think about it abstractly. Actually remember it sensory-wise. Where were you? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you feel in your body? Really place yourself back in that moment. Notice what happens in your body as you remember. Does your breathing change? Does your heart rate increase? Do you feel tension somewhere? This is your nervous system reactivating the protective response. This is the grip engaging. Just notice it. Don't judge it. Don't try to change it. Just observe. This is what my nervous system does when it perceives this particular threat. Now name it. Say to yourself, this is the fear of being seen as incompetent, or weak, or selfish, or stuck, or whatever the specific fear is. This is the fear that I made a vow to protect myself from. This fear makes sense. It protected me. But this is not actual current danger. This is an old threat being activated. And then, here's the key. Allow your body to do something different. If you're sitting, stand up and shake. If you're tense, let yourself make sound, cry, moan, growl, whatever comes out. If your breathing is shallow, breathe deeply and slowly until your nervous system settles. You're not trying to reach a particular emotional catharsis. You're just giving your body permission to discharge the protective energy it's been holding. You're creating the condition where your nervous system can learn something new. This practice might feel small, but it's where the real transformation happens. Because this is where your nervous system gets the direct, lived experience that it's safe to let go. This is where the grip begins to dissolve, not through understanding, but through the body discovering safety in a situation where it previously felt threatened. Chapter 5. Open New Paths, Your First Step into the Unknown. 3 weeks after James first cried in his bedroom, 3 weeks of noticing and naming and releasing, something shifted in him that was almost imperceptible at first. He was sitting at his desk at work, a desk he'd occupied for the past 15 years. And he realized that he felt lighter. Not happy exactly, but lighter. The constant vigilance, the endless monitoring of control, the exhausting work of maintaining the image he'd constructed, all of that had loosened its grip just slightly. And in that loosening, something unexpected appeared. Space. A small pocket of space where something new might be possible. Up until this point in the shadow system, the work has been mostly internal. You've seen your shadow. You've felt your pain. You've understood the vows that emerged from that pain. You've begun to dissolve the grip those vows have on your nervous system. But now we arrive at the 5th step, the O, which stands for Open New Paths. And this is where the internal work meets the external world. This is where you begin to actually move differently, act differently, choose differently in the real circumstances of your actual life. This is where transformation stops being something you understand intellectually and becomes something you embody through action. But here's what makes this step terrifying for most people. Opening new paths requires you to do something that directly contradicts the vows you've spent your whole life protecting. If your vow has been, "I must always be in control," opening a new path means doing something without guaranteed outcomes. If your vow has been, "I must never be a burden," opening a new path means asking for something you need. If your vow has been, "I'm not the kind of person who changes course midlife," opening a new path means considering a change that terrifies you. Opening new paths requires risk, and risk, from the perspective of your nervous system, equals danger. This is why most people get stuck here. They do the internal work beautifully. They see their patterns. They feel their pain. They understand intellectually that their vows are outdated. And then they come to the moment where they actually have to do something different, and they freeze. The nervous system says, "This is unsafe. We've built our entire life around safety. Why would we risk that?" And many people listen to that voice. They stay where they are. They keep the vows. They keep the prison, because at least the prison is familiar. James came very close to doing exactly that. About a month after he'd started the work, his boss called him into his office and asked him to head up a new initiative. Something he'd been wanting for years from a career perspective. It was an exciting opportunity. It was also guaranteed to keep him exactly where he was. The safe choice. The controlled choice. The choice that aligned perfectly with his vow. I'm not the kind of person who changes course midlife. He could take this role, stay in the company for another 10 years, retire with a good pension, and never have to risk or change or become something other than what he'd been. And his immediate impulse was to say yes, to take the safe path, to protect himself by not risking anything. But something had changed in James through the work he'd been doing. The grip had loosened enough that he could feel something underneath the impulse to stay safe. He could feel desire. He could feel wanting something other than what was safe. He could feel the pull toward a life that was actually his, not just a life he'd constructed as a protection against old pain. And he realized something that became a turning point. I don't want to be safe anymore. I want to be alive. So James did something that violated his deepest vow. He told his boss no, not rudely, not impulsively. He was thoughtful and professional, but he said no. He said that while he appreciated the opportunity, what he needed to do right now was something else. He didn't have it all figured out. He didn't have a perfect plan. But he knew that staying in the same role, in the same company, would mean choosing safety over aliveness. And he was no longer willing to make that choice. He asked for a leave of absence. He asked to step back while he figured out what he actually wanted to do. His boss was surprised. His team was surprised. His wife was surprised, though perhaps more supportive than surprised. And James was terrified. Every night for the first week after he'd made the decision, he'd wake up in the middle of the night in a panic. His nervous system was screaming at him. You've made a terrible mistake. You've thrown away security. You've risked everything. You've violated the most fundamental vow that's kept you safe. But something else was happening too. For the first time in decades, James felt alive. Not content, not comfortable, but alive. The constriction that had become so much a part of him that he thought it was just who he was. That constriction was loosening. His breathing was deeper. His awareness was sharper. His sense of possibility was expanding in a way that felt both exhilarating and deeply unsafe. He was in uncharted territory. The map he'd been following his whole life no longer applied. This is what opening new paths feels like. It's not triumphant. It's not the kind of narrative where you make a bold decision and everything works out perfectly. It's actually quite disorienting, because the path isn't open yet. You've just decided not to walk the old one. And now you're standing in the space between where you were and where you're going. And that space is full of uncertainty. Your nervous system hates uncertainty. Your nervous system wants to know what's going to happen. Your nervous system wants guarantees. And none of those things are available. What's available instead is something else. What's available is the possibility of finding out who you actually are when you're not protecting yourself. What's available is the chance to discover what you actually want when you're not organizing your life around a vow. What's available is the opportunity to live a life that's actually responsive to who you are now, not controlled by decisions you made when you were younger and more vulnerable. The specific decision James made, to take a leave of absence, to step back from his role, wasn't necessarily the right decision for you or for anyone else. What matters about his decision wasn't the content of it. What matters was that he did something that directly contradicted his deepest vow. He risked the very thing he'd sworn never to risk. He stepped into uncertainty, and in doing that, he discovered something crucial. He survived. The vow that said, "I must never take risks. I must always maintain control. I must never change course." That vow was based on an old belief that risking would destroy him. And when he risked, when he opened a new path, nothing destructive happened. What happened instead was that he became more alive. This is the crucial information that your nervous system needs in order to actually let go of the vow. It's not enough to understand intellectually that the vow is outdated. Your nervous system needs the direct experience of violating the vow and surviving. Your nervous system needs to discover through living that the thing it's been protecting you from isn't actually what will destroy you. It's the protection itself that's what's been destroying you. Slowly, quietly, gradually, through a life that gets smaller and smaller. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Opening new paths doesn't mean making reckless decisions. It doesn't mean throwing away security without thought or planning. It doesn't mean quitting your job or ending your relationships or taking actions that will genuinely harm you or the people you care about. What it means is becoming willing to do something that feels unsafe within the context of your actual life. It means choosing something that aligns with who you actually are over something that aligns with the vow. It means taking a risk that matters to you, even though it feels like danger to your nervous system. For some people, opening a new path might be having a difficult conversation they've been avoiding. For some people, it might be enrolling in a class or pursuing a creative project that they've talked about for years but never done. For some people, it might be asking for help with something instead of carrying it alone. For some people, it might be ending a relationship that no longer works. For some people, it might be speaking up in a meeting when they would normally stay silent. The specific action doesn't matter. What matters is that the action directly violates the vow that's been limiting you, and that you do it with awareness and intention. The neurobiological thing that happens when you open a new path is actually quite beautiful. When you do something that contradicts your vow, when you risk something that your nervous system told you would destroy you, and you discover that you didn't get destroyed, your brain gets updated information. The old neural pathway that says, "This is dangerous," gets competing information that says, "Wait, actually, that wasn't destructive." And that competing information, if you repeat it enough times, begins to create a new neural pathway. You begin to have a lived experience that contradicts the vow. And lived experience is far more powerful than intellectual understanding when it comes to changing how your nervous system perceives threat. Here's what I want you to do right now. Think about the vows you identified. Think about the path that you've been walking. The one that keeps you safe, but also keeps you small. Now imagine something that would contradict your deepest vow. Something that would feel unsafe to your nervous system, but that would align with who you actually are or who you actually want to become. Not something reckless, not something harmful, but something that feels genuinely risky to you. Something that would require you to step outside the protection that the vow provides. What comes up? Maybe it's a conversation you need to have. Maybe it's an opportunity you need to take. Maybe it's something you need to ask for. Maybe it's something you need to stop doing. Maybe it's a way you need to show up differently in your relationship, your work, your creative life. Whatever it is, notice what comes up. Notice the resistance. Notice the fear. Notice the voice that says, "This is unsafe. You'll regret this. You should stay where you are." That's your nervous system. That's the vow. That's the protection that's been running your life. And then ask yourself, is this protection still serving me? Or am I ready to open a new path? If you're ready, the next step is to take one action this week. Not a huge action. Not something that will burn your entire life down. But one concrete action that opens a new path. One thing you can do that directly violates the vow and demonstrates to your nervous system that you can survive it. Tell someone no when you normally say yes. Ask for something you normally would handle alone. Risk being visible in a way you normally hide. Take one step into the unknown. Do it with awareness. Do it with intention. Do it with the understanding that your nervous system is going to resist, that it's going to tell you it's unsafe, and do it anyway. Because here's what James discovered in those first weeks of opening a new path. The discomfort of doing something that contradicts the vow is not the same as actual danger. Your nervous system conflates the two. It says, "This feels dangerous, so it must be dangerous." But feeling unsafe and being unsafe are very different things. When you can make that distinction, when you can feel the fear and do the thing anyway, something shifts. The prison begins to open. The path begins to unfold. And you begin to discover that you're far more capable of living than you ever believed while you were protecting. Chapter 6. Wield True Power. Integrating your past into your present. 6 months after James took his leave of absence, he sat in a small office that was nothing like the executive suite he'd occupied for 15 years. The space was modest, the furniture was simple, and there was no nameplate on the door announcing his importance or his title. But for the first time in decades, he felt completely at home in the space he occupied. Because this wasn't a space he'd constructed to protect himself, or prove himself, or maintain an image. This was a space that reflected who he actually was, not who he'd spent his whole life trying to become. Over the past 6 months, James had completed the entire shadow journey. He'd seen his shadow, the invisible filters that had been running his life. He'd harvested his pain, the grief and rage and desperation that emerged when he finally allowed himself to feel what he'd spent decades protecting from. He'd audited his vows, the 3 fundamental promises he'd made to himself that had shaped every decision of his adult life. He'd dissolved the grip those vows had on his nervous system through the work of noticing, naming, and releasing. He'd opened new paths by taking concrete actions that contradicted his deepest fears and showed him that he could survive them. And now he'd arrived at the 6th step, the W, which stands for Wield True Power. And this is where something remarkable happens. This is where the internal transformation meets the external reality, and they begin to shape each other. This is where you stop running from your past and start building with it. This is where your shadow stops being a prison and becomes a source of wisdom and strength. What James had discovered through this entire process was something that most people never learn. Your vows, your protective patterns, the armor you built. These things aren't your enemies. They're not things that need to be destroyed or eliminated. They're things that need to be understood and integrated. They're part of your story. They're part of what made you who you are. And when you can accept that, when you can stop fighting against them and instead work with them, something extraordinary becomes possible. The vow, "I must always be in control," had been born from watching his parents lose control. And while that vow had cost him decades of aliveness, it had also given him something real. It had given him the ability to stay steady in crisis. It had given him the capacity to think clearly under pressure. It had given him the discipline to follow through on commitments. These weren't weaknesses. These were strengths that had emerged from his adaptation to his family situation. The problem wasn't the strengths. The problem was that he'd organized his entire life around them, as if they were the only strengths he possessed. The vow, "I must never be a burden," had emerged from his mother's anxiety and his attempt to protect her from additional stress. And while that vow had isolated him and prevented genuine intimacy, it had also cultivated something valuable in him. It had developed his capacity for consideration. It had taught him to notice what others needed. It had made him someone people could rely on. It had built his ability to think about the larger system rather than just his individual needs. Again, these weren't flaws. These were genuine capacities that had been forged through his early experience. The vow, "I'm not the kind of person who changes course mid-life," had come from cultural messages and his father's model, and the fear created by his failure at 25. But that vow had also protected him long enough to build something solid. It had kept him from making reckless decisions. It had allowed him to develop expertise in his field. It had given him the stability to raise a family and build a life. It had created the conditions where he had the resources to eventually do the deeper work that transformation requires. What James had learned was that you don't transcend your past by rejecting it. You transcend it by integrating it. The vows aren't things you need to get rid of. They're things you need to make conscious. You need to understand when they serve you and when they limit you. You need to develop the flexibility to choose when to activate them and when to let them rest. You need to become the author of your patterns rather than remaining their victim. This is what wielding true power means. It means taking everything you learned in service of protection and survival, and consciously choosing how to apply it in service of aliveness and growth. It means having access to your strength without being enslaved by it. It means understanding your nervous system's protective mechanisms so deeply that you can work with them instead of being controlled by them. About 2 months into his leave of absence, James had begun to do something he'd been thinking about for years, but had never had the courage to attempt. He'd started a consulting business focused on something he actually cared about: helping midlife leaders navigate the kind of transformation he'd been going through. Not as a retreat from the corporate world, but as a way to bring what he'd learned directly into service. It was terrifying at first. His nervous system kept insisting that this was unsafe, that he should go back to what he knew, that he was throwing away security for something uncertain. But here's what he discovered: the qualities that had served him in his corporate career, his ability to think clearly, his discipline, his conscientiousness. Those qualities served him equally well in this new venture. The difference was that now he was applying them in service of something he actually believed in, something that aligned with who he actually was, rather than in service of a protective image he'd constructed decades ago. And something else happened too. As James built his new business, he found himself operating from a place of genuine power rather than defensive control. He could make decisions without needing to prove something through those decisions. He could ask for help without feeling like a burden. He could acknowledge uncertainty without it threatening his sense of competence. He could fail, and he did fail multiple times, without it activating the old trauma from his 20s. Because he was no longer operating from the vow. He was operating from conscious choice. The clients who came to work with him responded to something they sensed in him. They sensed that he'd walked the path they were beginning to walk. They sensed that he understood not just the theory, but the actual lived experience of transformation. They sensed that he wasn't going to offer them false promises or quick fixes. He was going to walk with them through the difficult process of seeing their shadow, feeling their pain, understanding their vows, dissolving the grip, opening new paths, and learning to wield the power that comes from integration. And what was remarkable was that in helping them do this work, James deepened his own integration. Every vow he helped a client audit, every grip he helped them dissolve, every new path they opened. All of it deepened his own understanding and his own ability to live from his true power. Because true power isn't something you achieve and then you're done with it. True power is something you continually develop through practice, through conscious choice, through the ongoing work of integrating who you've been with who you're becoming. There was a moment, about 5 months into his new business, when James was facilitating a session with a group of midlife leaders, and he found himself telling them something that made him fully understand the transformation he'd undergone. He said, "The past doesn't block you. Your relationship with the past blocks you. And the way you change your relationship with the past is not by denying it or fighting it or trying to overcome it. It's by understanding it so completely that you can see the wisdom in it, the protection in it, the love that was underneath it, and then consciously choosing how to carry it forward." One of the people in the session asked him, "So you're saying we should just accept our patterns and live with them?" And James paused, because it was a crucial question, and he wanted to get the answer right. He said, "No, I'm saying that you should understand them so deeply that you can work with them consciously. You can say, 'This pattern protected me, and I'm grateful for it. And it's no longer serving me in this way. So I'm going to transform how I use this capacity.' That's different from just accepting the limitation. That's transcendence. What James had discovered, what every person who completes this shadow journey discovers, is that you contain multitudes. You contain the protective parts that learn to survive. You contain the stronger, more expanded parts that want to grow and risk and become. You contain the wisdom that comes from having lived through difficulty. You contain the aliveness that comes from opening yourself to genuine possibility. You don't have to choose between these things. You get to integrate them. This is what wielding true power means. It means no longer being at war with yourself. It means no longer dividing yourself into the acceptable parts and the parts you need to protect from. It means recognizing that every adaptation your nervous system made, every vow you created, every protective mechanism you developed, all of it was an act of love. It was your system trying to keep you alive. It was your younger self doing the very best they could with the information and resources they had. And from that place of understanding and compassion and gratitude, you can consciously choose to evolve. You can consciously choose to take the wisdom and the strength and the capacity that emerged from your protective patterns and apply them in new ways. You can consciously choose to open yourself to experiences and relationships and possibilities that you'd previously closed yourself off from. You can consciously choose to live a life that's actually yours instead of a life that's just a reaction to your past. Here's what I want you to understand as we move toward the conclusion of this section. The work of shadow doesn't end when you complete these 6 steps. These 6 steps are a framework for a beginning, not a final destination. The shadow will never fully disappear. It's part of being human. The pain will never fully resolve. It will always be part of your story. The vows will never fully dissolve. They're wired into your nervous system. But your relationship with all of these things can transform. Your ability to work with them can deepen. Your capacity to live from your true power rather than from your protective mechanisms can expand. James is still working on this. 6 months into his new business, 6 months into his new life. He still has moments where the old vows activate. He still has moments where his nervous system says, "This is unsafe. You need to control it. You need to protect yourself." But now he recognizes those moments. Now he can notice them and name them and choose something different. Now he can say to himself, "I see you, protective system. I understand why you're trying to protect me. Thank you for keeping me safe all these years. And I'm safe enough now to take a different approach." That's what wielding true power actually means. It's not about being fearless. It's not about having conquered your shadow. It's about becoming conscious enough, integrated enough, and compassionate enough with yourself that you can work with all of who you are. The protective parts and the growing parts, the scared parts and the courageous parts, the old you and the emerging you. All of it in service of a life that's actually yours. Chapter 7. 3 Myths That Kill Your Midlife, and Why They're Completely Wrong. Now that you understand the shadow system, now that you've seen how your past creates filters and how you can dissolve them and open new paths, there's something crucial that still blocks most people from actually doing this work. It's not a lack of understanding. It's not a lack of motivation. It's myths. Deeply embedded cultural myths about what's possible and what's not possible when you reach midlife. And these myths are so pervasive, so accepted as common wisdom, that most people don't even recognize them as myths. They think they're facts. I want to address 3 of the most destructive myths about midlife transformation. The myths that keep people locked in the patterns we've been discussing throughout this book. Because until you understand that these facts are actually just stories that have been passed down and accepted without question, you'll keep organizing your life around them. Myth number 1. It's too late to change at my age. This might be the most pervasive myth of all, and it touches something very deep in all of us. The assumption is that there's a window of opportunity for change, presumably in your 20s, maybe extending into your early 30s. And after that window closes, you're locked into the life you've built. You made your choices. You have your patterns. You've hardwired your neural pathways. And now, at this stage of life, you're too old to fundamentally alter who you are or what your life looks like. This myth is so persistent that most people don't even question it. They just accept it as truth. And it's a particularly cruel myth for people in midlife, because it arrives at precisely the moment when many people are beginning to feel that their current life isn't actually working for them. They're waking up to the reality that they've organized their existence around vows and patterns that no longer serve them. And the voice in their head immediately says, "Too bad. You're past the point where you can change that." But here's what the neuroscience actually shows us. Your brain remains neuroplastic, meaning capable of forming new neural pathways throughout your entire life. Not as rapidly as in childhood, not as easily, but genuinely and substantially. The capacity to change isn't something you lose at 40. It's something you lose when you stop trying. Your nervous system doesn't care whether you're 25 or 55. If you expose it to new experiences, if you practice new behaviors, if you engage in conscious choice-making, your brain will reorganize itself in response. But don't just take my word for it. Look at actual human history. Look at the people who made major transformations in their lives well past the age of 40. Laura Ingalls Wilder, the woman who would write one of the most beloved American book series of all time, Little House on the Prairie, didn't publish her first book until she was 65 years old. For most of her life, she was a farmer, a teacher, a wife. She lived a quiet, ordinary existence. But at an age when most people are settling into the comfort of their established patterns, she decided to write down the stories from her childhood. And what emerged from that decision was a masterpiece that would touch millions of lives across generations. Her nervous system adapted to a completely new challenge at an age when, according to the myth, she should have been incapable of that kind of transformation. Or look at Grandma Moses, the woman born Anna Mary Robertson Moses. She grew up poor. She worked as a farmhand and a domestic worker for most of her life. And it wasn't until she was 78 years old, 78, that she picked up a paintbrush and decided to paint. She had arthritis. She had spent a lifetime doing physical labor that most people would say had used up all her creative energy. But instead, at an age when retirement is the only socially acceptable option, she started creating. And her paintings became celebrated in galleries and museums around the world. She painted for more than 2 decades after she started. Her brain didn't decline with age. It flourished once she gave it permission to do something completely new. The myth says, you're too old to change. But the evidence says, you're exactly the age where change is most powerful because you finally have the resources to do it properly. You have experience. You have skills. You have emotional maturity that you didn't have in your 20s. You have perspective that comes from having lived. You have the resources to support yourself through uncertainty. You have wisdom. What you might not have is time, which makes change even more urgent, even more necessary. The real issue isn't your age. The real issue is that you've been living according to vows that keep you protected, and those vows feel like who you are. And changing who you think you are is always uncomfortable at any age. But the myth gives you permission to not even try. It gives you a convenient excuse. I'm too old. And that excuse costs you everything. Myth number 2. My family, money, obligations won't let me. This is the myth of external limitation. The belief that you can't change because of circumstances outside yourself. You have a mortgage, you have dependents, you have financial obligations, you have people who depend on you. These constraints are real, and it would be wrong to dismiss them. But what's also real is that people often use these real constraints to justify vows that go far beyond what the constraints actually require. James believed this myth deeply. He believed that his financial responsibilities meant he couldn't risk his career. He believed that his family depended on his stability, which meant he couldn't rock the boat. He believed that his mortgage meant he had to stay in a job he no longer believed in. And all of these things seemed objectively true. But when he actually began to examine them, something shifted. Here's the thing about external limitations. They're often the external manifestation of internal vows. You tell yourself you can't leave your job because of financial obligations. But actually, deeper down, you're afraid of risking the identity that the job provides. You tell yourself you can't ask your partner for support because it would be a burden. But actually, deeper down, you're protecting a vow you made about never needing anyone. You tell yourself you can't pursue what you actually want because of family obligations. But actually, deeper down, you're protecting a vow about who you're allowed to be. And here's what's remarkable. When people begin to transform their internal vows, their external circumstances often reorganize themselves in surprising ways. This doesn't mean that real constraints disappear. It means that your relationship with the constraints changes. It means you can work with them creatively instead of being paralyzed by them. It means that some constraints that felt absolute become more flexible than you thought. It means that other people in your life often respond to your transformation by transforming too. Think about Dolly Parton. She grew up in extreme poverty. Her family had 12 children living in a one-room cabin in the mountains of Tennessee. By every measure, her circumstances were against her. She didn't have access to resources. She didn't have connections. She didn't have the education or the stability that most people consider prerequisites for success. But here's what's crucial. She didn't use those constraints as an excuse to stay small. Instead, she transformed her relationship with those constraints. She used every resource she had: her voice, her creativity, her resilience. And as she gained resources and power, she made a conscious choice to use them to transform the very circumstances that had constrained her. She built a foundation to help children in poverty. She invested in her hometown. She used what she had to create change around her. The external constraints Dolly faced were real. But they weren't the limiting factor. The limiting factor would have been if she'd accepted the myth that her circumstances determined her destiny. Instead, she understood something crucial. Your external circumstances can change when you change your internal vows about what's possible. The myth says, external circumstances are the problem. But the truth is, your relationship with external circumstances is the problem. And when you change your relationship with the vow, your relationship with the circumstances often changes too. Myth number 3. This is just how it is at my age. This is the myth of inevitability. The cultural narrative that says midlife is supposed to feel a certain way. Tired, constrained, resigned. You're supposed to have given up on your dreams and accepted your limitations. You're supposed to be grateful for what you have rather than wanting something more. You're supposed to understand that this is just what life is like when you're past 40. There's an underlying assumption in this myth that youth is the time for possibility and aliveness, and age is the time for contraction and acceptance. And this assumption has become so normalized that even people in their 40s and 50s often just accept it as truth. They feel the contraction, and they assume it's inevitable. They don't realize that the contraction isn't inevitable. It's a choice, usually an unconscious choice, made in service of the vows. But what's remarkable is that every single person who has genuinely transformed their life in midlife reports the same thing. The contraction was a choice. It wasn't inevitable. It was something they were doing in service of protection. And once they stopped protecting, the contraction lifted. The evidence is clear. You're not too old to change. Your circumstances are more flexible than you think. And midlife is not a time of inevitable contraction. It's a time of tremendous potential. But you have to be willing to question the myths. You have to be willing to look at the actual evidence rather than accepting conventional wisdom. You have to be willing to imagine that your life could be different than what the culture is telling you is inevitable. Because the moment you stop believing the myths, the moment you see them as myths rather than facts, something becomes possible. The possibility of your own transformation. The possibility of living differently. The possibility of a life that's actually yours, rather than a life that's just a resignation to what you thought was inevitable. Here's what I want you to understand about these myths. They're not random. They're not accidents. They exist because they serve a function. They exist because people benefit from your believing them. Systems benefit. Industries benefit. The status quo benefits from you believing that you can't change, that your circumstances won't allow it, that this is just how things are. But you don't have to believe these myths. You can look at the evidence. You can see the people who have contradicted these myths through their actual lives. You can understand that these myths are just stories. Powerful, culturally reinforced stories, but stories nonetheless. And stories can be rewritten. Chapter 8. How this works in real life. When everything actually changes. 6 months into his transformation, James sat across from his wife Helen at the dinner table, and something happened that would have been impossible a year ago. She had just told him about a conflict she was having with her sister. And instead of immediately offering solutions or dismissing the problem as not worth worrying about, James simply listened. He asked her questions. He made space for her feelings without trying to fix them. And then, something even more remarkable happened. She asked him how he was doing, not in the casual, "how was your day" way that had characterized their conversations for years, but with genuine curiosity. And instead of saying, "I'm fine," which was his automatic response, James paused. He told her the truth. He told her that he was terrified about the business, that he wasn't sure if he'd made the right decision, that some days he woke up in a panic thinking he'd thrown away everything he'd built. And instead of that honesty creating distance between them, which was what his nervous system had been predicting his whole life, it created the opposite. It created intimacy. His wife leaned across the table and reached for his hand. She said, "I've been waiting for years to hear you say something real like that. I felt like I was married to a robot, not a person." And in that moment, James understood something visceral that he'd only understood intellectually before. The vow, "I must never be a burden," wasn't protecting his marriage. It was destroying it. The protection was what was killing the connection. This is what transformation looks like in the actual circumstances of your life. Not in a therapist's office or in a journal or in some abstract sense. In the real, messy, complicated relationships that make up your existence. In your marriage and close relationships. Before the transformation, James had been what you might call the stable one in his marriage. He was the one who didn't have emotional needs. He was the one who was always there, always reliable, always in control. Helen had come to depend on this, but she had also come to resent it, though she couldn't quite articulate why. She felt managed rather than loved. She felt like she was married to someone who was performing the role of husband rather than actually being present as a person. What James discovered when he began to dissolve the grip of his vows was that his stability had been purchased at the cost of authenticity. He could be reliable, but he couldn't be real. He could be present physically, but he was absent emotionally. And this created a particular kind of loneliness that happened in the midst of a committed relationship. The loneliness of being with someone who isn't actually there. As James began to show up differently in his marriage, something shifted. He started telling Helen about his fears. He started asking for support instead of pretending he didn't need it. He started acknowledging when he was wrong instead of defending his position. And Helen began to soften. The resentment that had been quietly building for years began to dissolve. Not because he suddenly became perfect, he didn't, but because he became real. What's crucial to understand is that this didn't happen because James read some books about being a better partner. It happened because he dissolved the vow that was preventing intimacy. He did the internal work, and the external relationship naturally reorganized itself in response to that internal shift. But here's the thing that nobody tells you about opening your marriage to real vulnerability. It's terrifying, because the vow, "I must never burden anyone," carries with it the belief, if people see the real me, they'll leave. And when you start letting people see the real you, your nervous system is waiting for the abandonment. It's braced for rejection. And often, the first time your partner responds with compassion instead of rejection, you actually cry. You cry because you realize you've been protecting against something that wasn't actually happening. You cry because you've spent decades alone while married, and suddenly you're not alone anymore. James had this experience about 3 months into his transformation. He was telling Helen about a failure he'd experienced with one of his clients, someone he'd been working with who decided his approach wasn't working for them and asked for a refund. And as he was telling the story, expecting Helen to say something like, "Well, you can't please everyone," she instead held his face in her hands and said, "I'm so sorry. That must feel terrible. And I want you to know that this doesn't change anything about how I see you. You're still someone I believe in completely." And in that moment, the old vow shattered. Not completely. Vows don't work that way. But enough that he could see it was based on a false belief about what people would do if they saw him struggling. If you're in a relationship, this is one of the most powerful applications of this work. The vows that have been limiting you are also limiting your relationships. And the moment you begin to dissolve them, your relationships have permission to become real. In your work and professional life. Before the transformation, James had been a successful executive. People respected him. He got results. He was someone you could count on. But his success was built on a particular kind of power, the power of control, the power of having all the answers, the power of never admitting uncertainty. This worked, but it came at a cost. His team was afraid of him. They didn't bring him their best ideas because ideas involve risk and uncertainty. And James's vow meant there was no room for either. They brought him safe ideas. They stayed small in his presence. When James opened his consulting business, when he began to work from a place of integration rather than protection, something shifted in how he showed up professionally. He could acknowledge what he didn't know. He could ask for input from people on his team without it threatening his sense of competence. He could admit mistakes and actually learn from them instead of defending against them. And his clients responded to this completely differently. They sensed that he wasn't trying to prove anything. They sensed that he actually cared about their transformation, not just about maintaining an image of expertise. But here's where the vow still shows up. In moments of failure. A client challenged his methodology in a group session, and James felt it. That old activation. The vow, "I must always be in control," which means I can't admit I might be wrong. His nervous system said, "This is a threat. You need to defend, you need to reassert your authority." And for a moment, he almost did. He almost shut down the challenge, the way he would have a year ago. But because he'd been doing the work of notice and name and release, he caught it. He created that micro pause. He noticed the activation. He named it. This is the fear from being publicly questioned, which triggers the old belief that my competence determines my worth. And instead of defending, he said to the client, "That's a really important challenge. Tell me more about what's not landing for you." And what emerged from that conversation was actually incredibly valuable. The client's challenge helped him refine his approach. And more importantly, the client felt genuinely seen and heard rather than managed. This is what happens when you dissolve the vow in your professional life. You become more effective, not less. You become more powerful, not weaker. But it's a different kind of power. It's not the power that comes from control. It's the power that comes from genuine confidence. Confidence that you can handle whatever comes, that you can learn from challenges, that you don't have to have all the answers. But there's also something that happens that most people don't anticipate. When you stop organizing your work around the vow, when you stop needing to prove something through your work becomes less important. Not unimportant, but less central to your identity. James discovered that he could have a successful business and it not define him. He could have a failure and it not devastate him. And this created a kind of freedom that he'd never experienced before. He could actually enjoy his work rather than using it as a proof of worth. In your relationship with yourself. But perhaps the most important application of this work is how you relate to yourself. This is where the real transformation lives. Before, James had spent his entire adult life in a kind of internal dialogue of judgment. He would do something and immediately evaluate it against a standard. Was he in control? Did he fail? Did he burden anyone? Did he stay on the safe path? And if the answer to any of these questions was no, if he fell short in any way, there was a voice in his head that was merciless in its judgment. That voice wasn't his voice. It was the voice of his father, of the culture, of all the places he'd absorbed the message that he wasn't enough unless he met the standards set by the vow. And he had internalized that voice so completely that he thought it was wisdom. He thought it was protection. But it was actually cruelty, administered by himself toward himself. As James began to do the work of integration, as he began to see his vows not as truth, but as protective strategies, something shifted in that internal relationship. The voice didn't disappear. It still shows up. But now when it shows up, he can recognize it. He can say, "I see you. You're trying to protect me. Thank you for that. And I'm safe enough now to handle this differently." This might sound like a small thing, but it's actually everything. Because most people spend their entire lives running from the voice that's trying to protect them. They spend their entire lives believing that they need to be punished if they fall short. They spend their entire lives in a state of internal warfare. And the moment you can recognize that the voice is protection, not truth, everything changes. James had an experience about 4 months into his transformation that illustrated this perfectly. He lost a significant client. The business was new enough that losing anyone felt like a threat. And his immediate response was the old one: self-recrimination. You should have seen this coming. You should have handled it differently. You failed. You're not good enough at this. The voice was loud and clear and absolutely merciless. But because he'd been practicing the work of integration, he could hear the voice and recognize it for what it was. He could say to himself, "This is the fear that I'm not competent," which triggers the belief that I'm not worthy. That fear made sense when I was 25, and I actually did fail at something that mattered. But I'm not 25 anymore, and I've proven to myself that I can build something. And losing one client doesn't negate that. And in recognizing the voice, in naming what it was protecting, the grip loosened. He didn't spiral into shame. He didn't defend against the failure. He simply looked at what had happened, extracted the learning from it, and made adjustments. This is what happens when you wield true power. You're no longer at war with yourself. You're no longer being driven by vows you don't even remember making. You're no longer punishing yourself for not meeting standards you never consciously agreed to. And that internal peace, that cessation of internal warfare, that's when you actually become free to live. The question that still haunts you, what if I fail? Beneath all of this work, beneath all the transformation and the opening of new paths and the wielding of true power, there's a question that still lurks. It's the question that keeps people from actually doing this work in the first place. It's the question that activates the vow most powerfully. And it goes something like this. What if I do all this work? What if I dissolve the vows? What if I open new paths and I still fail? What if it doesn't work? What if I lose everything? This is the question that haunted James even as he was experiencing the transformation. Even as his marriage was improving, even as his business was growing, even as he was feeling more alive than he had in decades, there was still a voice that whispered, "But what if it all falls apart?" And here's the thing that nobody tells you. That voice might be right. You might fail. You might lose things. You might make choices that don't work out the way you hoped. The vow wasn't protecting you from nothing. It was protecting you from the real possibility of failure and loss. But here's what James discovered through actually living the transformation. Failing and being destroyed by failure are two completely different things. He had already failed at something that mattered, the business venture at 25, and he had survived it. He had built a life afterward. He had become competent and accomplished. The failure hadn't killed him. What had almost killed him was the decades he'd spent protecting against the possibility of ever failing again. When you dissolve the vow, when you open yourself to real possibility, you are accepting the possibility of failure. You are saying, I might try this and it might not work, and I'm going to do it anyway. And the remarkable thing is that most people find that they can actually handle that. They find that they're more resilient than they thought. They find that failure doesn't mean destruction. It means learning. It means recalibration. It means becoming stronger. James's business did not grow without obstacles. He had clients who weren't happy. He made decisions that he later realized weren't optimal. He had moments when he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But he also had something he'd never had before. He had the capacity to handle those moments without it destroying him. He had the capacity to fail and stay open, to fall and get back up, to be wrong and learn from it. This is the secret that the vow is trying to protect you from understanding. You can survive failure. You can survive loss. You can survive being wrong. The protection isn't necessary. And the cost of maintaining the protection is higher than the cost of risking. Your shadow is your superpower. As James continued his work, as he continued to dissolve the vows and open new paths and integrate what he discovered about himself, something remarkable happened. He stopped seeing his shadow as something to overcome. He started seeing it as something to work with. He started seeing the vow, I must always be in control, not as a limitation, but as a superpower, if he could learn to apply it consciously. Because here's what he discovered. That vow had given him something real. It had given him the capacity to stay steady in crisis. It had given him the discipline to follow through on commitments. It had taught him how to think systematically and plan carefully. These weren't weaknesses. These were genuine strengths that had emerged from his adaptation to his family situation. The problem had never been the strengths. The problem had been that he'd organized his entire life around them. as if they were the only strengths he possessed. In his consulting work, James began to teach his clients something that changed everything. Your shadow isn't your enemy. Your vows aren't something to destroy. They're something to integrate. They're wisdom that your nervous system gained through survival. And when you stop fighting against them and instead learn to work with them consciously, they become your superpower. This is what happens at the deepest level of integration. You stop seeing your past as a prison, and you start seeing it as a teacher. You stop seeing your vows as limitations, and you start seeing them as wisdom. You stop being at war with yourself, and you start being allies with yourself. The shadow that had been running you unconsciously becomes a conscious resource that you can actually use. And this is where true power emerges. Not from conquering your shadow, not from transcending your past, not from becoming someone different, but from becoming conscious enough, integrated enough, and compassionate enough with yourself that you can work with all of who you are. The protective parts and the growing parts, the scared parts and the courageous parts, the old you and the emerging you. All of it in service of a life that's actually yours. 1 year after opening that box in his garage, James sat in the same space. Everything was different. The garage had become a place where he actually wanted to be. On the wall was a photograph from his consulting work, people who'd completed the shadow journey. The letter he'd written at 25 was now framed in his office. Every time a client asked how he'd started, he pointed to that letter. And each time he told the story, he understood it more deeply. The letter wasn't a condemnation. It was a doorway. This is not the end of your journey. What you've learned isn't something you understand once and you're done. It's something you practice, return to, deepen with every application. You've learned that your past doesn't determine your future. Your relationship with your past does. You've learned that your nervous system changes through lived experience, not intellectual understanding alone. And you've learned that transformation at midlife isn't too late. But here's the honest answer to the question you're thinking. You probably will slip back into old patterns. That's the normal process of transformation. Your nervous system has been wired a certain way for decades. What you can do is become aware enough, practiced enough, and compassionate enough that when you slip back, you catch it quickly. Notice, name, release, begin again. This is the real work. The more you name the specific fear underneath, the more your nervous system trusts that you understand. James's transformation isn't special or unique to him. It's available to you. It's available to anyone willing to do the work. And the work isn't hard or complicated. It just requires practicing the principles you've learned. It requires being willing to feel uncomfortable, to take risks, to be vulnerable, to fail and try again. Imagine yourself 1 year from now having done this work consistently. You've noticed your vows activating, named them, released them. You've taken small risks that contradicted your protective patterns. You've practiced being real in relationships. You've integrated the wisdom of your shadow instead of being controlled by it. What would be different? Maybe your closest relationships would have more depth and authenticity. Maybe your work would feel meaningful. Maybe you'd take a risk you've been afraid to take and discover you're more capable than you thought. As we close, I want to leave you with one final truth. Your shadow, your vows, your protective patterns. These aren't your enemies. They're the solution to a problem that no longer exists. They're the wisdom your nervous system gained when it was trying to keep you alive. The gift of transformation is learning to thank these protections for what they've done, and then consciously choosing whether they still serve you. 1 year from now, you could be sitting in your own version of James's garage, looking back on the year that changed everything. amazed at how much has shifted, how much lighter you feel, how much more alive you are. The invitation is open. The path is clear. The work is simple, though not always easy. And it starts with one thing: your willingness to see your shadow, to feel your pain, to understand your vows, to dissolve their grip, to open new paths, and to wield the true power that comes from integration. The choice is yours.